Hey guys, how's it going? This is Natinator, and welcome to a new Creepypasta series. This is an amazingly well-written story, with some real scare factor in it too. You're gonna love it. So without further ado, I give you the first part of 3 in the Harlequin series. Harlequin No.7. Now, as always, turn out the lights, get comfortable, and let the story begin. The world is indeed comic, but the joke is on mankind. H.P. Lovecraft. My town has gained some notoriety in recent weeks. Maybe you've heard about the strange electrical storm that showed up in Charlottesville, NC, overnight, and then disappeared just as quick. Or maybe you've read in the paper about the sudden outbreak of mental illness and cerebral aneurysms. Don't worry though, if you haven't been keeping up with the crackpot news outlets. I'll fill you in. How do I know so much about this? Well, let's just say I was there. For starters, the only reason I moved to this god-awful backwater hell in the first place was because my career choice made employment somewhat difficult to find. You see, most funeral homes are family-owned, so naturally the laws of nepotism apply. Doesn't matter that I had a degree in mortuary science, or that I had already completed my apprenticeship and director's certification by age 24. The fact that my daddy didn't own a crematorium meant I would be facing an endless hallway of closed doors until who knows when. That was, of course, until a visit to Bailey Meadows, my birth town, prompted enough boredom to look up an old friend, Terry Little. I met Terry around the summer of '05, at this cruddy little bar called The Broken Window, where bands would sometimes play shows if they couldn't find anywhere decent. He and I hit it off in a totally not homosexual way, and we spent a huge chunk of time around each other because Bailey Meadows was the most boring fucking place in all of North Carolina. That and the window was the only place within a 25-mile drive of my house that would serve minors. So, after wrapping up my apprenticeship in Raleigh, I moved back in with my parents due to the unemployment thing. Apprenticeships do pay, but the position was considered temporary at best. Emailed my resume along the entire East Coast, started going stir-crazy, and finally worked up enough motivation to drive my Charger west along Highway 42. Having spent the last 4 years in Raleigh made me forget what a shithole Charlottesville truly was. It's the kind of place where people don't mow their lawns because of all the scrap metal hiding under the weeds. The folk here were a strange breed of redneck, a cross between the Appalachian variety and the lower dwellers of the marshland. The town itself is just as terrible. There's the strip mall where all the stoners hang out, a library that smells like piss, a trailer park, the Trinity Baptist Church, a hospital, and the downtown area. Includes the Broken Window, a couple of family-run businesses, the post office, and the courthouse. The rest of Charlottesville is nothing but a series of abandoned farmhouses for about a 5-mile radius, and the ruins of an old paper mill that blew up in '88. I found Terry at the window, behind the counter, wearing a Sonic Youth t-shirt and wiping off the mugs. Turns out he and some dude named Franklin bought the place 3 years back, and had pretty much kept things the same since. "Don't fix what ain't broke," Terry said. After catching up on recent news and laughing about the time we spray-painted Miss Patterson's dog over a few shots of wild turkey, finally Terry mentioned that the Burnswick funeral parlour needed a new embalmer, because the old one went crazy and hung himself or something. Just like Terry to get me good and drunk before telling me something of actual importance. I called him an arsehole, and we both laughed so hard that I fell off the bar stool. That was when Terry made me hand over my car keys. I woke up the next morning feeling the way I imagined a corpse would feel, if it were to be dug up and smacked across the face with a shovel. Numb, but somehow still in pain. The next thing I noticed was that I was not in my parents' house. I was on Terry's sofa, or at least I hoped Terry's. Dragging myself to the kitchen, I drank at least a gallon of water straight from the tap before puking it all back up. The sound of me retching out my innards must have been loud, because the next thing I knew, there was an unfamiliar voice coming from behind. A girl's voice. "You must be Stephen. Terry said you were a lightweight." I turned around to match the voice to her face. She was about a head shorter than me, pale-skinned, skinny as a twig, and with one of those asymmetrical haircuts that have grown quite popular. Also, she was wearing a black t-shirt, 2 sizes too small, and no pants, just a pair of pink panties with a zipper down the front. "Call me Harris, and Terry's a dick. He should know to keep me off the firewater, ever since I hurled all over his drum kit," I said, wiping barf off of my lips while trying not to stare at her crotch. Naturally, I assumed that this chick was either Terry's girl, or, at the very least, someone not to be caught with while pitching a tent. "Well, Harris, I'm glad you made room for breakfast, 'cause I'm making waffles." "Fuck yeah, waffles." During breakfast I found out that her name was Billy Joe Kimball. And yes, she was Terry's girl. Fiancé, in fact. They met each other at the Broken Window 3 years ago. Billy was the bassist for a band called Chop the Willow, which she joined after moving here from Jacksonville. Why she would willingly relocate to this cesspool was beyond me, but she seemed to like it here. "It's got something you can't find in the city," she said. "This place has mystery." Looking back on things, Billy was probably right. Here's a bit of a historical mystery to keep you from getting bored. As I mentioned earlier, there was a paper mill just outside of town that caught fire in 1988. Some sort of industrial accident or some such. Anyways, a lot of people died in the resulting explosion, and it pretty much crippled the town economy. That's not the strange part. The topic of interest here was that the police couldn't figure out what caused the fire in the first place. No signs of arson or failed equipment, just a bunch of confused head scratches and rumors. What were these rumors, you ask? Well, from the witness testimonials, several floor workers reported that they heard laughter just before the fire started. Maniacal laughter. Like someone was in on some sick joke. After breakfast, I took a shower and got ready to head over to Burnswick. Lucky for me, I was already wearing a suit, so I didn't feel underdressed. I thanked Terry and Billy for letting me crash on their couch, and they wished me luck. Actually, Terry wished me luck and offered to give me a ride. I declined, on account of Charlottesville being so damn small that the only reason anyone living here should need a car would be so that they could drive the hell away. Seriously, it took me about 15 minutes to get to the funeral parlor on foot. I would have gotten there sooner if I hadn't stopped at the Fill U station for a pack of Camel. I cannot stress this enough. Smoking is a terrible habit, It eats up all your money and limits your ability to run for extended periods of time. When I walked into Burnswick Funerals, the first thing I noticed was the complete lack of reception. Normally there should be someone to oversee the front room, usually from a desk or nearby office. True, it's often better to call in advance to make funeral arrangements, but there really needs to be some sort of oversight for the possible walk-in. The second thing I noticed were the dead nightshade flowers on the coffee table. Rather unprofessional in my opinion. White lilies or orchids would have been better, and preferably not old ones. In any case, I decided to wait for someone to show up, and in the meantime I walked around the viewing room, looking over the black and white photographs framed around the walls. Fairly standard display. Trees, sleeping animals, churches, old Victorian portraits, other vaguely mournful images. Appropriate decor if I'd ever saw it. Interesting thing about 19th century portraits and why they often seem somewhat creepy. Most of the people you'll see in them are actually dead. Old school photography was a time-consuming process, meaning subjects would have to remain still for a few hours while the silver nitrate imprinted the light. Also, it was very expensive and therefore only used on special occasions, funerals being one of them. And since the person or persons getting their picture taken were post-mortem, there would be no need to worry about fidgeting. I was pondering this knowledge while viewing a picture of a little girl with dead eyes, propped up in a chair, when I heard a door close somewhere in the lobby. Turning around, I saw a confused-looking man staring at me. "Can I help you, sir?" he finally asked after a few awkward moments. He was an older gentleman, somewhere in his mid to late 50s. He wore a pair of wire-framed glasses and showed signs of unwanted balding, but no signs to immediately raise the question of whether or not he liked to sodomize the dead. Trust me, necrophilia is not a desirable employer trait. "Yes, you can, actually. I heard that you're in need of a new embalmer." I extended my hand for approval. "I think I might just be the man for the job. I'm Stephan D. Harris. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Burnswick," he replied, shaking my hand. "Alfred Burnswick. And yes, actually, I lost my main undertaker a few weeks back. A real shame, too, what happened." He sighed in frustration before going on. "It's just been me and Leonard running this place since. Let's talk. First of all, have you done any apprenticing?" About an hour later, the deal was sealed. I'd finally broken into my target occupation. So what if it was in Charlottesville? I could always relocate after a few years. But for now, it was my time to shine. It didn't take long for me to get used to things under Mr. Burnswick. In fact, after the first embalming, he pretty much left me to do my own thing. After all, I'd been training my entire adult life for this line of work. Whether I had a question as to where a particular wound filler or sanitizer was kept, I'd just ask Leonard. Lenny ran the cremation end of Burnswick, but would also fill in as an embalmer from time to time. But for the most part, it was the same basic procedure that I'd been doing in Rayleigh. First, I'd scrub down the cadaver. Then, I'd massage the limbs to relieve rigor mortis. Following that, I'd plug up the orifices, seal up any open wounds, begin the arterial embalming, wire the mouth and eyelids shut, finish up the hypodermic embalming, dress the cadaver, apply makeup, and deliver the body to the viewing room. I didn't even have to deal with any of the surviving family members, or review any death certificates. Mr. Burnswick, as the lead funeral director, would take care of all that noise. The only other regular of the funeral home was the flower girl, receptionist, grief counselor, Madeline Wade. Now, before I move on, I would like to say that business at Burnswick Funeral was moderately steady, but this was not because people in Charlottesville were dying all the time. Most of our clients came from a wide group of people in Pitt County, who chose us based mainly on our comparatively modest fees. So after about a month, I'd saved up enough money to straight up buy my own house in Charlottesville for the price of a used car. It was an okay little place on Milton Street, about 2 blocks away from the broken window. Things were alright for the most part. I hated the town and all those Confederate flags, but getting back into the groove with Terry made it tolerable. After most work nights, I'd just walk over to the window, drink a few glasses of wild turkey, and argue with Terry about which actors from the Rocky Horror Picture Show were actually dead. Other nights, I'd stop by to listen to Chop the Willow practice their set in Terry's garage before turning in for the night. Billy's band was surprisingly decent, I must admit. They had that kind of outlaw sound of the Black Angels or Murder by Death that went over well with a mostly southern blue-collar audience. To sum it all up, life was getting comfortable. Until the day I found the thing in a jar. At first, I didn't know what the hell it was that I was looking at. Actually, I still have no freaking clue. But I mean, I really didn't know what it was. I found it on a shelf in the storage closet one day at work when our embalming machine busted a tube, and I had to look around for a possible replacement. Up on the top shelf, shoved into the far back, was a cardboard box labeled Miscellaneous that at first seemed promising. I got on a step stool, and just like any other day, I pulled something off a shelf. What I found inside the box didn't actually startle me. Not at first, but it did pique my interest. Surrounded by random pieces of newspaper and spare calipers, was an average-sized mason jar coated in a layer of dust and grime. It was definitely full of some sort of fluid, dark green, so it wasn't formaldehyde. Also, it had a label on the side that read Harlequin No.7, which seemed cryptic to say the least. The layer of dirt on the outside and the dark liquid inside made it almost impossible to see what sat in there. So, of course, I cleaned it off with a damp rag and held the jar up to the fluorescent light for a better look. Whatever that thing was, it was ostensibly organic, based off of the pale flesh tone color. It looked like some sort of mutated potato, but that's a stupid comparison. If I had to guess, I'd say that it was an extracted tumor or maybe a diseased pancreas. The top half was bulbous, with little protruding bumps here and there. The bottom half had a tail, curved similar to the spine of a mammal fetus. Also, along the midsection were several thick tendrils that corkscrewed off in every direction. It was an odd thing, but not so odd as to alarm me. True, it was uncommon to find such things in a mortuary, but on the other hand, coroners would often keep certain specimens of interest when discovered, usually out of scientific curiosity. Who's to say what sort of things Leonard or my predecessor or even Mr. Burnswick have found while poking around inside of people? I'd have kept it if I were the one to find it. Only I wouldn't have hidden it away in a box. I put the Harlequin on the counter next to the hand sink and went about looking for a replacement tube. I found one eventually, thank God, so the rest of the day went on normally as ever, save for the occasional glance at the green jar. I resolved to ask Mr. Burnswick if he knew anything about the thing in a jar after the viewing service upstairs was over. I really didn't want to pester him, but I couldn't leave an enigma like that unanswered. It was just too naggy to ignore. When I finally got a chance to show him the strange thing, he took a close look into the cloudy green jar after reading the label, but in the end, he just shrugged and said it was probably just a gaffe, or a weird prank set up by the previous mortician, Ryan Wilcox. Not a huge stretch. The name Harlequin kind of made it seem plausible that the whole thing was a joke. Still, I wanted to be sure. I kept a dissection kit at home in my medicine cabinet, and, being licensed as both an embalmer and as a funeral director, I was legally allowed to handle and transport human remains, if that was indeed what the Harlequin was. Seeing no qualms about bringing it home for further study, I cleaned up the undercroft and headed home with the mysterious jar. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to inspect it more closely until the following night. I had Sunday off, and I had planned to go out into the open field gun range with Terry and Billy Joe, while the rest of the town wasted their time in church. More space for us. I had a good time blowing apart teddy bears and tacky lamps at the range. Billy kept shouting, "It's coming right for us!" right before unloading a round from her 12-gauge into one of the stuffed bears. And Terry was, and always has been, such a terrible shot, that he eventually became so irate that he threw down his handgun and proceeded to smash apart a lamp with a tire iron that he got out of his trunk. I even managed to get a few good shots off myself. Of course, I would have done better if Terry hadn't been shouting things out like, "Score one for the corpse fucker," and other such distracting remarks. Eventually, Billy joined in on the mocking, and asked me if it was true that morticians go around killing people to promote business. No, that's Burnswick's job, actually. I just set up the marionette strings for the puppet shows, I responded. Jokingly, of course. "Hey, do what you gotta do," chimed in Terry. "Just don't go crazy like the last one." "Yeah, hey, I've been meaning to ask about that. Why'd Wilcox off himself anyway?" I asked. "You don't know? It was in his obituary. Apparently Ryan Wilcox's wife died in the paper mill fire, and he started to get more and more depressed and withdrawn over the years. It sorta makes sense. He had to deal with all the funerals of nearly everyone who died there. His wife, her co-workers and friends and all that. He just couldn't live with it anymore. Said so in the note he left." Billy kicked the dirt with one of her chunky motorcycle boots, clearly getting bored with the conversation. "You think we can talk about something a bit less depressing? We're here to have fun and ignore gun safety, not get all emo and shit." "I didn't mean to be such a downer," I said, while loading up my revolver. "I just wanted to know why. I found something at work yesterday that might have been his." Terry started to giggle. "No, it wasn't porn, Terry, you arse. It was some weird thing in a jar. Like, maybe a mutant organ or something. I was planning on slicing it up today, actually." "Can we watch?" asked Terry and Billy in unison. Sigh. Some people are really into the macabre, I guess. We got back to my place a few hours later after the gun range shenanigans and a late lunch at the local Greasy Spoon. The sun had already started to set, basking the early autumn sky in an orange glow. Terry in the passenger seat of my Charger, Billy Joe in the back with her shotgun laying across her lap. Pulling into the gravel pit that constituted a driveway, I delegated the camcorder to Terry and requested that Billy refrain from poking things. I don't have a copy of the home video we made. I destroyed the original after mailing a couple copies to various news outlets a few days after Billy and I had finished hunting down the surviving cultists. But I remember enough of it to cobble together a transcript. Video recording. The scene starts with a shot of Mr. Harris walking out of his bathroom. He's wearing a black apron over his suit and a pair of latex gloves. His face is partially obscured by a surgical mask. Terry, behind the camera. Are you ready to win the Nobel Prize for incredibly fucked up pseudoscience? Harris. Absolutely. Those morons hunting for Bigfoot won't stand a chance this year. Billy Joe, outside of view. Hey guys, let's get this over with. I want to use the afterbirth to make soup. Chuckles. Terry follows Mr. Harris into the living room, where he has set up a few card tables to organize his equipment. On it, we can see several empty mason jars. One jar full of what appears to be formaldehyde. A dissectomy kit includes 2 scalpels, a pair of tweezers, tissue scissors, a curved probing tool, a hypodermic needle, and a clamp, a microscope, and a copy of the Physician's Dark Reference Volume 29. Last, in the center on a metal cooking tray, sits the Harlequin. Harris, holding Harlequin No.7 up for the camera. This sick little puppy here is something I found in a mortuary yesterday. We're not yet sure what it is exactly, but my working hypothesis is that it's an alien fetus. Either that, or a 10 times scale model of Terry's penis. The frame is briefly blocked by Terry's extended middle finger. Terry. Fuck you, Stephen. Harris. Right then, move over here. I'm about to open the jar. Terry moves to a better angle and zooms the camera into focus over the Harlequin. Harris, twisting the lid off with a slow hiss, followed by a loud pop. Holy hell, it stinks. Grimacing. Nurse, please note that the subject smells like someone barfed into a diaper. Billy Joe, now in frame. I'm not the nurse, damn it. I'm just in charge of soup. Harris, returning to frame. All right. I am about to remove the specimen from its protective jar. Mr. Harris inserts a pair of salad tongs into the jar and removes the Harlequin proper. Note here that a minor distortion affects the shot. Well, it's definitely organic, judging by how squishy it is. Carefully placing the subject onto the cooking tray. Oh wow, this might actually be an alien after all. Check out these veins wrapping around the head bubbles. And, Jesus, is that an eye? Terry directs the camera for a closer inspection. From what we can see, there does appear to be an orb that closely resembles the likeness of an eye. Also, during the close-up, another line of distortion moves across the length of the screen. Terry. Dude, you should poke it with something. Harris. Science is more than just poking shit, you know. But yes, I should take a look under these flaps here. Mr. Harris tentatively prods the strange orb with the blunt end of his probing tool. Unfortunately, the screen pixelates slightly, so we do not get a chance to view this maneuver. Also, during this scene, the camera begins to pick up audio feedback, despite there being no reason for it to do so. Harris, jerking his hand back. The fuck? Billy Joe. What's wrong? Harris, looking startled into the camera. Shit! Did you catch that, Terry? Terry. I didn't catch anything, man. Your camera's acting all stupid. Billy Joe. What's going on? What happened? Harris. I thought I saw it twitch a little. I probably just bumped the table or something. Billy Joe. Are you fucking with us? Terry. To Billy. Yeah, he's fucking with us. Harris, waving his hands in frustration. Forget it. Terry, move back a little. You're crowding me. I'll start over. Mr. Harris resumes his attempt to investigate Harlequin No.7. He lifts one of the supposed eyelids with his probing tool, and as before, the camera pixelates slightly and picks up feedback, but the overall video quality is decent enough to grasp the situation. A minute goes by with Mr. Harris handling several tools before the light above the card tables begins to flicker. At first, only Billy notices this effect. Billy Joe. Hey guys, points to the light. Terry, directing the camera between Billy, the light bulb, and Mr. Harris. Okay, hey, I'm getting kinda creeped out now. Harris, in center frame. Right, okay. Let's do this later. Mr. Harris attempts to handle Harlequin No.7 with the salad tongs. Holy shit, it's moving! Billy Joe. Get rid of it! Get it out of here! At this point, the audio drops, and the screen becomes highly distorted. From the few images that remain somewhat clear, we can infer that Mr. Harris is struggling to reinsert the Harlequin into its original container. The camera also manages to capture several yellow-green pulses of light, but it is unknown whether or not this effect can be contributed to the near-constant visual distortions. This portion lasted for approximately 43 seconds, ending when audio is restored with a loud gunshot. When the visuals stabilize, we can see that Billy is pointing her shotgun at the splattered remains of the Harlequin. We can also see that her nose is bleeding. Harris, nose also bleeding. Thanks for that. Billy Joe, breathing heavily. Yeah, no problem. Terry, yelling. What the fuck was that? Harris, to Terry. How much of that did you manage to film? Terry. I don't know, man. The goddamn video kept going out. If I could... Oh, I don't feel so... The camera becomes shaky, and we can hear the sound of Terry vomiting. Billy Joe, running to Terry's side. It's alright. We're alright. Just calm down. Terry. Don't tell me to fucking calm down. Or did you forget that the room just exploded right now? What were those noises? Mr. Harris appears to try to say something, but stops himself when a thunderclap shakes the room. No one says anything for several seconds, until a flash of yellow-green is seen coming from the nearby window, followed by a second thunderclap. Harris. Outside! Now! Terry follows Billy and Mr. Harris outside onto his front lawn. Billy and Harris are looking directly overhead, followed by the camera doing a sweep over the night sky. What we see is a massive thunderhead approaching from the east, and several flashes of chartreuse lightning entangling the dark clouds. Harris. Terry, Billy, get back inside. The video ends there. So yes, we did manage to film the previous events, all the way up to our view of the approaching storm. Unfortunately, a good deal of what was recorded ended up being completely unwatchable, so I'll have to fill in the damaged bits. First of all, when I was attempting to remove the part that looked like an eye, the Harlequin started writhing and squirming around, which was highly unexpected, to say the least. The next thing I knew, the lights in my house began to pulse, and the air in my living room started to shimmer like hot asphalt in June. I panicked and tried to put the Harlequin back into its jar, hoping that would make it stop doing whatever it was that was making the high-pitched screaming that seemed to be coming from all around us. It didn't, even after I secured the lid. In fact, after I shoved it back into the fluid, the damn thing started flashing this blinding green light that made my head feel like it was about to explode. I still have a hard time remembering at what point Billy returned with her shotgun, but after she blew the Harlequin into little giblets, everything stopped. Except for the storm. On September 23rd, 2009, 56 men, women and children claim to have seen the bizarre electrical storm that passed over Charlottesville, beginning at approximately 9:13 p.m. EST. These eyewitnesses were the only apparent claims of any weather phenomena, as not a single meteorological study supported such accusations. The storm in question lasted only a few minutes, but because of the witness statements, phone calls, and the complete disregard of the professional news outlets, people in town referred to it as a sign of the end days. The most vocal of these statements came out of the Trinity Baptist Church, which is a whole separate story in itself. More on that some other time. Now, after cleaning up my living room and storing what little of the Harlequin remained into sample jars, Billy and Terry went home for the evening. I didn't sleep that night. I had too much to reflect upon from what had transpired. I was exhausted the next day at work. Exhausted and nervous. Some part of my brain had been switched to panic mode, and it refused to shut down. I tried to just move along in my work, hoping that it would take my mind off that horrible otherworldly screeching. Looking for any excuse to preoccupy myself, I volunteered to pick up a body from the Charlottesville General Hospital. Madeline got a message from earlier in the morning and had arranged to fulfill a pre-need tomorrow afternoon for a Mr. Havenbrook, who had died sometime last night. I didn't bother asking for any details. I just fired up the hearse and left. I got to the hospital about 10 minutes after filing the paperwork at the courthouse. I didn't get a chance to talk to Dr. Sarah Little, Terry's aunt and the Pitt County coroner, which was a bit of a disappointment, but I did have an interesting conversation with her assistant, Robert. "So, how'd this guy kick it?" I asked Rob while he was helping me load Mr. Havenbrook into the hearse. "Well, from what I heard from Sarah, he and his wife were checking out that freaky lightning storm last night, when all of a sudden this guy drops to the ground and starts having a seizure. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone." "Weird," I said out loud. "What did the autopsy show?" "Aneurysm," said Rob, pulling out the MRI shots of Mr. Havenbrook's head. "Probably brought on by the seizure. See that blotch right there at the base of his brainstem? That's a popped artery." I shut the back of the hearse and thanked Robert. From his point of view, everything seemed fine. Flashing lights are known to cause seizures, so big deal, right? I, however, regretted ever leaving the mortuary. I was looking for a way to forget about the events of last night. Instead, I found out that I may have inadvertently caused the death of a perfectly innocent man. It was a very unwelcoming feeling, like an omen of doom. I got Havenbrook's body back to the mortuary not long after. Lenny was off that day, and Mr. Burnswick was busy with a client, so I had to move the cadaver downstairs myself. The funeral home had an elevator installed just for this purpose, and while the stretcher helped, Mr. Havenbrook weighed at least 300 pounds, so it took a good deal of effort on my part to move his fat ass onto the slab. Once I got him up onto the embalming table, I took a few minutes to catch my breath before proceeding with my work, all while trying not to think about who this man was. Step 1 was to wash the body in antibacterial soap and water. I always hated this part, due to the fact that there's always fecal matter residue caked around the arse cheeks and upper thighs. But at least, it's far less disturbing than the second step. Ever give a full-body massage to a dead guy? Well, I have. The embalming process requires that a body's circulatory system be unconstricted, and for that the muscles need to be relieved of rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscle tissue, due to an interruption in the ATP cycle. Interestingly enough, Mr. Havenbrook had hardly any stiffness to him, something that I had not noticed until this point. Rigor mortis sets in at around 3 hours after death, peaking at around 12 hours, before dissipating between 48 to 60 hours. Havenbrook had been dead for a little over 13 hours. His back was red and purple from liver mortis, internal body fluids succumbing to the forces of gravity. So clearly, his heart muscles had ceased functioning. The only rational explanation would be extremely rapid decomposition, a hypothesis that I was capable of testing myself by simply jamming a cooking thermometer into his gut. Yes, I was obligated to investigate this issue, as it may be health safety related. Think biohazard CDC guys lining the mortuary in yards of yellow tape. I gave the thermometer a couple of minutes to warm up while I got myself into a hazmat suit, just in case. The internal body temperature of the post-mortem lowers quite rapidly after death, but will eventually elevate as microbes multiply from within. Mr. Havenbrook had spent most of the night in a cooler, so if he was any warmer than the air-conditioned room temperature, then I would have to call in the cavalry. Also, Dr. Little would probably be fired for not taking a proper blood test. And the internal heat index was 64.3 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree lower than the room. He was fine, and I felt like an asshole in a scuba suit. That, and now I had to patch up the hole I had put in his intestinal wall. Good job, Harris. Now you won't get to have a lunch break. I didn't bother taking off the hazard suit while I rushed to make up the lost time. Probably a good thing too in retrospect. After I had sealed up the hole and plugged up the anus with cotton swabs, I began the long process of embalming. I started the same way as I always had, by making a small incision into the right common carotid artery, the other into the jugular vein. The embalming fluid would be pumped into the carotid artery, which pushes the displacement out through the jugular and down a drain. For a man the size of Mr. Havenbrook, the whole thing would take about an hour and a half to complete, so I started up the pumps while I prepped for the hypodermic stage. As I walked toward the sink to wash off my gloves, I noticed that the lights were beginning to flicker. I stopped walking mid-stride. My heart dropped into my stomach as I began to hear a wet, smacking noise coming from the supposedly lifeless cadaver of Mr. Havenbrook. What I saw when I turned around made me drop the surgical tray to the ground. His eyes were open, and they were staring directly into mine. His mouth was opening and closing, as though he were trying to say something, but no noise was being made, save for his right arm limply slapping at the tubing in his neck. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to think. All I could do was stand there, motionless, with my back pressed against the sink. For the first time in my life, I wished that I had gone to law school. It wasn't until the air started to shimmer that I realized what was happening. When I finally understood why the Harlequin was numbered. 24 years ago, Ryan Wilcox found himself in this exact same situation. The storm, the aneurysm, the blotch at the base of Havenbrook's brain. There was more than one Harlequin. At least 6 others. And they were parasites. They lived inside of people, lying dormant until the time came to awaken. Something else also came to mind. Just before it burst out from the back of his skull, Havenbrook began to smile. Just before the squirming thing slithered down the drain, I heard the sound of laughter. Maniacal laughter. Like someone was in on some sick joke.